Assalamualaikum and greetings to all. Welcome back to our video lecture slide series, and this is week 11. Today we are going to look at particularly how culture and development give some sort of impact into national culture. Before that, let's have a look at the course learning outcome for this particular video lecture slides. And at the end of this video lecture slides, all of you should be able to classify the cultural traditions that are tangible and intangible effectively. And ladies and gentlemen, this is our course learning outcome 3. To begin with, the title particularly for this particular video lecture slides, the cultural turn in development. So we are going to look at what is national culture, what is local culture, and then we are going to give examples for both of these national as well as local culture. Ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to introduce to you one other type of culture, which is what we call popular culture. But let's have a look at what we have here first. So national culture. In 1970, the government of Malaysia had introduced what we call national cultural policy. So in Malaysia, when we talk about national cultural policy, it actually refers to whatever that we want to actually acknowledge or recognize as national culture. Now, this policy has 3 elements. The first one, the national culture must be based on the indigenous culture of the region, which is this Malay Peninsula. And secondly, the second element, suitable elements from the other culture may also be accepted and included as part of the national culture. And last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, and this is, I believe, the most important, if let's say you want to do number 2 of the element, then Islam is an important component in the formulation of the national culture. So basically, to sum up, this national cultural policy, the functions is actually 2. Number 1, we can say that it is as a guide when you do some sort of cultural development. So you use national cultural policy as a guide. And number 2, this national cultural policy is actually to ensure, I would say, harmony as well as peaceful life in the country. So that's the 2 main functions of national cultural policy. So 3 elements. The first one, the national culture must be based on the indigenous culture of this region. Number 2, suitable elements from any other cultures can be accepted and included as part of the national culture. And 3, so if you want to do number 2, then number 3 must be followed. Islam is an important component in the formulation of the national culture. So that's on national cultural policy, and this was established in the 1970s. Now, let's have a look at the first element in a little bit more detail. The national culture, what does it mean by when we say the national culture must be based on the indigenous culture of this region? Ideally, Malaysia is in the region where we have our neighbors, Indonesia, the Philippines, Singapore, Brunei, Thailand and Cambodia, as well as the Pacific Islands such as Polynesia, Melanesia and Oceania. And this whole region has been a very critical component when you talk about Malay civilization as well as Malay culture. And the Malay language has been used as an international language in trade relations. Another term for this would be lingua franca. I believe that you have actually encountered the term lingua franca when you were in your secondary schools. The culture of this region actually share several similarities in terms of the language used, but you have a little bit of variation. The language, basically the basis is the Malay language, and then we have almost similar historical experience. Most of us in the region were once colonized by imperial power such as the British, and we also have the Netherlands, the Dutch, and we also have the Spanish people coming in to colonize, especially in the Philippines. And the Malay culture today, we can sum up It is as a way of life and symbol of identity of more than 200 million people who speak almost the same language. And because of this, the culture of these indigenous people from this region, which you can actually summarize into the fact that what we call too as the Malay culture, and this forms the basis of our existing national cultural policy. So this is the first element. The second element that we're going to look at in a little bit of detail. Suitable elements from other cultures can also be included or accepted as part of the national culture. Ladies and gentlemen, culture can change. The practices in one particular community can change, and because of that, culture is what we call as a dynamic phenomenon. And because of this relation that is dynamic, sometimes when you see something, maybe that's not the final practices, because it's always ongoing, it's always evolving. And because of this, we must always adapt and we must always assimilate. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, we have actually talked about cultural adaptation, we have actually talked about cultural assimilation, and these two concepts are very critical when you talk about the changes that are happening in our surroundings today. And these principles of the fact that culture is dynamic takes into consideration the multicultural aspects in our various layers of societies. And because of that, you can see that sometimes the Malays have actually understood the Chinese practices or cultures, and the Indians have actually understood the Chinese cultures, and so on and so forth. And if, let's say, we find that any of the elements or practices, when you talk about cultural practices, it can be food or it can be clothing, it can be anything, and if we find that all this can be actually converted or can be accepted and included in the national culture, then that can be done as well. And in this case, this kind of acceptance must be following the provisions in the constitutions and the principles of Rukun Negara, as well as the national interest. And as I said earlier on, most importantly is actually all these cultural practices from other cultures must actually adhere to or follow the Islam as the official religion, which brings us to the third and the last element of the national cultural policy, which is Islam as the main or important component in the formulation of the national culture. And in Malaysia, we have national language, we have national flower, we have national costume, and we also have a national religion. And the official religion of the country is Islam. Religion or the belief in God is important to every kind of development in a country. So in order for a country to progress well, the country or the people, I would say, must have faith in any religions that the people or the citizens choose to believe in. And for Malaysia, the official religion or the national religion is Islam. So Islam in this case provides the kind of direction in terms of how to actually develop or acknowledge the national culture. And because of this, as I mentioned earlier on, I think several times I've mentioned the fact that if, let's say, we want to have one particular practice from a Chinese community to make it into a national culture, then it must actually follow this Islam as one of the important components for the formulation. Now let me give you a very simple example. Today, the national food for Malaysia, we have three. We have nasi lemak, and then we have roti canai, and then we have for the Chinese community what we call as dim sum. So we have nasi lemak from the Malay culture, roti canai from the Indian culture, and then we have dim sum. So let's say dim sum is actually originally if you look at the ingredients to actually cook dim sum, some of it may not be halal. So in order for a dim sum to be accepted as the national culture, then the ingredients used must be halal or Sharia compliance. So that's why, because we want to introduce this as our national culture, all ingredients in roti canai, in nasi lemak, and in dim sum, they must be Sharia compliance. So it is as simple as that. But ladies and gentlemen, after this we are going to look at what we call as local culture. And to some extent, I do believe that some of the cultural practices cannot simply be national culture. Now, I'm going to explain why after I have explained what is local culture. So basically, local culture is actually a little bit different from national culture. National culture is practices in Malaysia that are accepted by all Malaysians. So basically, when you talk about national culture, so everything, for example, the national language accepted by all Malaysians. In comparison to national culture, local culture is actually very specific and unique to one particular society or region. So local culture provides a more sense of identity for communities as well as residents or members of that particular communities. And this identity facilitates common understanding, traditions, as well as values that are all central to the people in that particular culture. And remember, I said just now, we have actually acknowledged dim sum as the national food for Malaysia because the ingredients they use halal ingredients. Now, for example, if you want to talk about local culture, why I said earlier on that to some extent we need to have cultural practices that are exclusively belonging to local cultures. Now, I'm going to explain one reason or example. Now, if let's say we want to acknowledge sari from the Indian community as a national costume, then the ladies wearing sari must actually cover everything. So there's no authenticity, there's no originality of the sari itself because it has been made to Sharia compliance. Everything must be covered. So that's why I believe to some extent that local culture, some of the cultural practices must remain in local culture. And this local commitment in order to preserve the identity and the originality among residents regardless of economic as well as political conditions can serve as a valuable tool in shaping the effectiveness of the development itself, the development options and local actions. And we can actually recognize this kind of commitment based on culture and common identity, and this can be seen or recognized as a potentially important tool in order to preserve or to sustain local government development as well as social improvement effort. So that's on local culture. So basically, national culture accepted by all Malaysians, local culture only accepted by that community, that small community. And before we go into this question here, I promise you that I'm going to talk about or introduce to you popular culture. So we have national culture, we have local culture, and popular culture is actually a term used to describe a trend. For example, in the past, in terms of entertainment, during my time, all of us were very crazy about Bollywood. And today, I think it has been for about almost 10 years, the youth or the youngsters, the teenagers, they love so much K-pop or K-culture, Korean culture. So maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, the trend will change. So that is what we call popular culture. So ladies and gentlemen, we have 3: national, local, as well as popular culture. Now, what is the relations? What is the relations between national and local cultures to power? So I may want to add here what is the relations between national, local, and popular cultures to power. So basically, how do these cultures affect power? So I'm going to leave you to think about this, and in our next class we are going to discuss this. So you can agree with something or you can disagree with something. It's okay. This is purely academic. So ladies and gentlemen, that's it for this video lecture slides week 11. To wrap up, these particular video lecture slides have introduced us or perhaps reintroduced us to national culture. The functions of national culture, we have two: as a guide, and secondly, to ensure harmonious and peaceful life in Malaysia. There are three elements of national cultural policy, which was established in the 1970. And then we talk about national culture. National culture are practices, basically elements in national culture or cultural practices in national culture are accepted by all Malaysians. And then we talk about local culture, where the cultural practices, they are unique to one and each particular culture or community only. And then we explore a little bit popular culture, which is based on trend. And then there's one question that we have to discuss in our next class. What are the relations between all the cultures that we have discussed, national, local, as well as popular, to power? Or another way to put it, how do all these cultures affect power? With that, ladies and gentlemen, should you have any questions, if you are not sure of anything, do not be shy. Contact me personally or in group, or you can ask the questions in our next class. With that, thank you very much. Assalamualaikum, ladies and gentlemen, and a very good afternoon or morning or evening to all of you. Thank you very much.